Rachel Reeves just announced her spending review. This is the government telling us where they will spend our tax money, and as such, it tells us what the government thinks is important. Really, it gives us a hint at where we might be heading as a country over the next few years. This is different from a budget which sets out taxes and the size of the spending pie. The spending review then slices up that pie between departments. I want to run you through some of the key parts of this today, but I also want to give you an understanding of how the numbers are presented so we can cut through some of the noise. There are two types of spending that we need to keep in mind. So we have capital spending. Think of this like roads, rail, concrete, and big kit investments. If you want to buy a lot of big ticket defence items for the armed forces, this is where it sits, in this capital spending section. Often described as investment as well. It's where a lot of the promises from Rachel Reeves in terms of extra spending fall into. Secondly, we have day-to-day spending. You might think of this as keeping the lights on, and it's often called current spending. It's the salaries for public sector workers, it's school running costs. If you want more doctors in the NHS, this is where you're going to get them from. Health and social care takes up a huge chunk of this type of spending, around 40% of the total. This is up a lot in comparison to 1999, where it made up about 26% of this type of spending. It shows how in percentage terms, the NHS has seen the largest rises over that time. There's little in the way of new money here for this day-to-day spending. And the key thing that we're going to look at is, who's had increases and as such, who's had cuts. And then what that means for our day-to-day lives living in, the UK. There's a whole other section of spending that isn't being discussed really today. And that's some of the more concerning stuff. That spending is often referred to as annual managed expenditure and includes things like pensions, welfare, or debt interest. It's the type of spending that we have little control over in the short term. It makes up about 700 billion a year, so it's actually the largest part of the spending. But really these events, like the one we've seen today, are used to focus on departmental spending, stuff like schools, police, healthcare. The winter fuel allowance would lean more towards annual managed expenditure, but because it's become such a political mess for the Labour government, they're looking to backtrack here and mention it where they can. So it's actually a smaller part of the total spending pie that we're looking at today, but you'll still see Rachel Reeves mentioning some huge numbers.
The spending review that I will be publishing next week will have more than £300 billion more spending over this Parliament than the plans we inherited just 11 months ago.
The employees at the bus factory clearly not impressed by the Chancellor's claims, and for good reason. Paul Johnson of the IFS cautioned against this big number ahead of the announcements today. I expect we'll hear such numbers bandied around extensively by the government side. Whether these numbers are even slightly meaningful, I will leave you to judge. They get to this 300 billion figure by taking all of the cumulative totals over 5 years and rolling them together. A lot can change over that time. And promising that we'll spend something in the future and then bringing it to today and going, look, this is what we're doing. It's kind of like saying, I walked 10 miles today, so over the course of a year, I walk 3,650 miles. The key is you actually have to walk the walk. Also, the figure is a headline figure. It does not adjust for inflation. So budgets could increase by 2% a year, but if inflation is also 2% a year, well, public services are not growing, they're just, keeping pace, aren't they? It's also potentially a bit misleading to present the figure based on previous plans set out by a previous government. A government who knew that, to put it bluntly, they were probably on the way out, and they had an interest in presenting the figures in a politically favourable way, let's say. So, they wanted to probably show lower spending, whereas Labour want to show higher spending. So basing your figures off the previous government's figures makes your figures look better. Paul Johnson put it nicely. This will be one of the tightest spending reviews in modern times outside of the austerity period of the early 2010s. So I'll break down the rest of the video into two sections, focusing on investment spending and then day-to-day spending. And we're going to start with investment because this is where a lot of the big headlines are. I want to start with housing. Labour pledged to deliver 1.5 million new homes. And these pledges were called foolish promises by Peter Bill, a housing journalist. Recently, it looked likely they will fall very short of these targets, so today Labour have announced a chunk of money aimed at helping them hit this goal, delivering the biggest boost to investment in social and affordable housing in a generation, confirming 39 billion for a new 10-year affordable homes programme. Here you can see the collapse in the amount of social rental homes over the last 70 years. The government wants to try and reverse this trend. But we've had promises of more homes before, haven't we? So how will this scheme differ? So I've done a bit of research and just briefly looked at the scheme and the proposals to try and get an understanding of it, and I'll give you an overview of what I found. So Labour's 10-year affordable homes programme, as it's been called, and the problem that local councils and housing associations face is building homes that are offered at a cheap rent is a pretty bad business model. You have to build it at the market rate, the house costs what the house costs to build, and then you basically offer it at a rate of rent that is below market value. So the government appear to be offering grants to help reduce the cost of building those social homes. I've seen figures banded about ranging from 80 to 90k per unit, but it depends on where in the country that you are. There is also a loan facility, and they also provide guarantees around rents long term. So they're claiming that they will increase the rate of the rent by inflation plus 1% a year. So this gives housing associations the ability to borrow against that predictable income. And these policies are designed to help make building affordable homes more competitive. Pushback will be that there's a skill shortage, so it doesn't matter if you can incentivize house building if there's not enough tradesmen to build the homes. And planning also continues to be a barrier, even if Labour are reforming this currently. But will building these new homes, let's say they do manage to do it, help? The OBR estimates that if the private and public sector deliver 1.3 million homes over this period, which is below the target of 1.5 million, that it would result in a price decrease on homes of 0.8%. That would shave about £2,000 off the average house price, saving people, say, like 200 quid in deposit requirements. Hardly meaningful, is it? Maybe inflation and rising wages will improve affordability as well as house prices stagnate, but there's a lot of assumptions there to get us to that point, isn't there? The next big thing they're planning to spend money on is defence spending, which won't come as a surprise to anyone. We're going to be spending billions on energy weapons, autonomous systems, munitions and infrastructure improvements, like making sure our armed forces personnel houses are fit for purpose. Local transport is another big investment at 15.6 billion over the period. As someone who lives in the north of England who's seen successive promises of transport improvements that have not really been delivered, I cringed when Rachel Reeves said today the Northern Transport Powerhouse or whatever.
Our ambitions for Northern Powerhouse Rail.
You know, I think Northern Powerhouse as a slogan is more a representation of the North-South divide than it is this proud war cry for Northerners. I think they need a new slogan. Trans-Northern? I don't know, off the top of my head. Write that down. What I like about these plans, though, is the clear emphasis on devolution, on giving local mayors control over their budgets. The success of Andy Burnham taking back the buses of Manchester will have likely inspired the government here. Who would have thought that the people who live in a place could plan the bus routes better than a load of people from Whitehall who've never even visited the place? Local transport needs to improve in this country. Leeds is the largest city in Europe without a subway, metro, light rail or tram. Get that guy from The Simpsons in. Monorail! Sorry. I don't want to be sceptical though, but the Leeds Supertram Act was introduced in 1993, and since then it's been announced and cancelled loads of times. I think for people who live outside of London, when they hear these sorts of promises, it's very much, I won't hold my breath and I'll believe it when I see it. Nuclear is another big investment. 14.2 billion set aside for this over the period. I won't get into if it's a good thing or a bad thing here. It's not really the remit of this channel, is it? And, you know, who am I to comment on it? But I know some people hate it, and I know other people think it's the only way that we can reach energy independence quickly. What I will say is that the figure of 20 billion, the cost quoted by EDF, seems low to me, considering Hinkley has an estimated cost that's reached 46 billion. In 2022, they said that that figure would be 26 billion. I just want to use this as an example of how infrastructure investment in the UK spirals out of control cost-wise. HS2 was another example of this. I think the UK government needs to address why that is the case. Because when you hear a French company going, oh, don't worry, it'll only cost 20 billion to build it, when we're currently building one at the minute that is severely delayed and doubled in price, you kind of question that quote. Can I be as flippant to say that we should ask for a fixed price quote from EDF? There's lots of other investment promises in this document. I've not had time to review them all. The spending review is over 100 pages. But those are some of the big ones that are in the headlines. Let's now look at day-to-day spending. So just as a reminder, this is the wages, the running costs, the day-to-day expenditure of the government departments. Rachel Reeves chucked around a number of 190 billion extra.
190 billion pounds more to the day-to-day running of our public services over the course of this spending review.
This is total over the period, so it would actually be about 38 billion a year if we spread it out evenly, which is only 3% of total public spending. Bunching it all together makes the figure sound massive, doesn't it? It also doesn't have that inflation impact built in. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in a second. But most of this money really was already announced. It's money that she raised through the budget and the spring statement with the changing of her fiscal rules and extra taxation. This is just her saying where she's going to spend it. The actual spending review, this document that I've linked below for you, has some useful charts that show us what they think is going to happen. The first table breaks down the spending by year, and you can see the large annual spending commitments to the NHS as an example. But let's also look at this table that tells us over the period, so between 2023-24 and 2028-29, the inflation-adjusted growth rate of these departments. So it looks in real terms, are the budgets going up or are they going down? So just as an example, coming back to the first table here, the Home Office budget at the end of this period is higher than it is today. Rachel could claim that that's part of her 190 billion that she's increased spending by. But as you see here, this is still a real terms cut because inflation will have made that budget get less stuff by then. So we see the Home Office forecasted to have a cut over this period, even though the budget has gone up in nominal terms. It's why this 190 figure and the 300 billion figure really should be taken pretty lightly. You can see all the big headlines here, so NHS, defence and education, transport falling in real terms. But remember, this is day-to-day spending and not the big investment stuff. So, that's how the Chancellor can say, I'm going to invest loads into transport and trains and do all these fancy things with trains, but we see a real terms decline in terms of the amount of day-to-day budget it gets. I do question though, I'm no train expert, but, I'm wondering, how can you spend all this money on trains and bring in all these new lines and do all this stuff, but then reduce the running costs? Maybe modern train systems are more efficient and require less day-to-day running costs? Another question that I have, but this one is for you. Does this reflect where you want to see improvements in the UK? Everyone's going to have a different view on what they see as essential spending, on where they think the government should put money. As someone who lives in the north with a terrible internet connection and even worse public transport, I think personally, just give me an internet connection while I'm on a train that works and I'd be happy because I could actually work then. Instead, when I travel to London, I'm on these Avanti West Coast sponsored Faraday cages that, just hamper my productivity. Imagine the productivity impact if we just gave all the commuters in the UK a solid, reliable internet connection on their way to work. But anyway, Labour are betting that this mix of spending on day-to-day costs reflects the desires of the UK public. Are you happy with it? Reeves will be keen to make it out that this is a massive commitment, but this chart from Sky puts it into context nicely for us. So these are the changes in departmental spending, both day-to-day and investment, at different reviews like the ones we've had today. So in the early 2000s, this is Gordon Brown. You then had Alistair Darling after this, and then George Osborne here. This is austerity, these huge cuts. And in recent times, investment compared to the past has been minuscule. And then here we are today. In a historical context, it's not that big. I don't want to downplay investment in our public services. I can't sit here all the time moaning that there isn't enough, get some and then moan some more. But what I hope we're seeing here is a reversal of the sort of doom spiral that we've been in, of low investment and low growth, which leads to cuts and then higher taxes for everyone. The UK for a long while now, basically my entire life, has had an investment rate that is significantly lower than its G7 peers. And it's criminal that we did not invest more when interest rates were near zero. But we didn't. And you can't keep up with our peers if you do not invest at the same level they do. The question then becomes, how do we fund all of this? Where does the money come from? How do we continue this investment long term to bring us back? We can borrow, of course, but UK borrowing costs are now higher than they were. And we can raise taxes, which will of course be very unpopular. I think the answer probably needs to be a bit of both. Borrowing for investment is very different to borrowing to keep the lights on. The investment really should pay for itself long term. And if it is tax instead, I challenge Rachel to not just whack a penny on income tax or choke everyone slowly by freezing tax bands again. Reform our clunky mess of a tax system, make council tax fairer, reshape land and property taxes, make sense of VAT. Just get creative and be brave, Chancellor. You missed that opportunity in your first budget. Autumn is your final shot. Because if you just rinse workers and businesses again, I think your time will be up.
Crunching the numbers, looking at the assets and the liabilities. And on that note,